Hello and welcome to ESG Talk, your go-to source for insights and advice from leaders in environmental, social and governance. I'm your host, Andie Wood. Today we'll be replaying a popular episode from Season 2 featuring Nadja Picard, partner and global reporting leader at PwC Germany. Nadja and I discussed how companies can embed sustainability into business strategy, as well as the roles of the CEO and CFO in championing sustainability goals and instilling control and credibility into the process. I appreciate how this episode weaves as well into the broader narrative of this season's theme, strength in numbers, and highlights the impact of our collective efforts. Let's all listen in. So let's start off by going back to something that I already mentioned, which is that reporting-led transformation. So can we offer our listeners a definition of what you mean? And with that, how can the act of reporting really result in broader change and actually benefit companies?
Yeah, thank you, Andie, for that question. It's to me, reporting, corporate reporting particularly, is all about transparency. And in the case of sustainability reporting, what the big standard setters that have their standards out are really looking at is a tie into a company's strategy of that sustainability reporting. With it comes disclosures around targets and the performance measurement against those targets. If you do that and expand your corporate reporting beyond your financial reporting to include that, it opens up a dialogue with investors and other stakeholders. And in that dialogue, companies, much like is the case with normal investor relations currently on financial reporting, will get impulses on whether investors understand the strategy, the targets, and the performance measurements, whether they like it in comparison to peers. So there is a true dialogue evolving from that, which will then result in the company possibly changing its strategy, its sustainability strategy, or even better said, its business strategy that embeds sustainability thinking. But if you do that, you need the proper data, and that reporting will then also, as you talk within your company about strategy and transparency, you need the data to support it, and that will already highlight issues within the company through the internal management reporting, because what gets measured gets really managed. So that is then the driver for the reporting-led transformation that will ensue within a company.
Yes, I noticed that obviously we finished on data. That's a pretty frequently quoted challenge with sustainability in general. But if we're thinking specifically about shifting from sustainability reporting being a compliance focus, a requirement, to something that's actually an area of opportunity, what kind of things do organizations have to do to achieve that? Is it a matter of changing their mindset? Is there more they have to do to cover that?
Yeah, I will get to data, but I will start with something else, Andie. I will start with actually the strategy angle again. Most of the sustainability reporting frameworks, and particularly again the big standards ISSB and the ESRSs that are out there, require a company to report on how their strategy takes sustainability matters into consideration, if and how. So they don't have to report something that is not there, but they will have to report how the strategy takes these things into consideration if they actually do. That's the first item of actually grasping the opportunity, because the alignment that needs to come with that within a company between the C-suite and supervisory bodies, directors all across the board, that's already the first instance where the debate and the discussion will unearth opportunities. Then again, if we then move from that broader debate into how can that broader debate be informed, we're back at the data challenge, right? So finding the right proper data that are reliable, that are transparent, that address the issues on point will then result in a deeper look into the organization and again unearth these opportunities.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we hear quite often is that there's a lot of focus on risk, but that organizations are finding it hard to find the time as well to look for opportunity. But I think you've just described that ideally that should naturally fall out of a process that they're working through. that leads them to both compliance and also should surface these opportunities?
Now, look, I'm sitting in Europe, right? So compliance is coming our way very, very quickly. I think if companies need to spend the time to become compliant, so I think it's better to spend the time wisely, even if you spend a bit more time in actually digging into the data and trying to understand and trying to optimize. And companies will be faced by the stakeholder demands, by the investor demands, by regulators wanting to understand what it is they're talking about. So I think it's really a missed opportunity if you don't try to look for the opportunities.
Exactly. So I think you've mentioned briefly already that there are standards behind a lot of this work. Historically, a very mixed patchwork of frameworks, but we've been moving forward a lot. And you were part of a panel at the World Economic Forum with Elko van der Enden, who is, of course, the CEO of the Global Reporting Initiative, often called GRI, as well as Emmanuel Faber, who's the chair of the International Sustainability Standards Board. And that panel was exploring the need for global alignment in reporting standards. And interoperability of reporting standards has, I think, come up in most conversations that I have had with sustainability professionals over the last year and a half. It's a really hot topic. So why is that alignment of the standards so important to everybody? And is that in part because of this backwards transformative effect on the companies?
Let's take the positive side of alignment and interoperability first for a second, if I may. So we've seen the publication of the final ISSB standards. We've now also seen the publication of the final ESRSs. And already almost the cry out of business and investors to urge both bodies to come to an understanding on how things look like has resulted in, for example, the definition of financial materiality to be the same. That's great. That will really start enabling better interpretation of reportings that are prepared under either standard. And they've also both commented very heavily on a lot of their climate reporting requirements being quite aligned, that there is already a lot of common ground. There is more common ground to be gained. And really, it is important to really get back to your question, Andie. It is really important because the transparency that we just discussed to stakeholders, to users of reporting, or inside a company to manage towards better outcomes, taking sustainability into consideration, will come at a higher cost if those data that are difficult to find and to report and to quality assure and control have to be reported in different ways because of different definitions, because of different boundaries, because of slight differences that are important for preparers, because it will also be very important for assurance providers. They are the last instance that needs to make sure that it's actually properly prepared on the basis status in alignment with the standards. If those nitty-gritty differences become too cumbersome, it will put too much burden on companies, and transparency and those opportunities that we just discussed will not be able to achieved, right? So that is really why everybody is asking for this alignment. It's not only the effort, it's also the time that is needed to unearth those differences, to explain them, that is much better spent on actually managing towards better outcomes.
Yeah, and I think we also hear there's been a steady demand for more comparability in the external transparent figures as well. And I've spoken over time to quite a few companies who are using different metrics or different internal calculations internally for their own management, and they're not able to necessarily align them with the external matrix that they're using. And I think everybody's just desperate for one set of information that actually describes everything comparably, whether that's in the house or externally to their investors and stakeholders. Obviously, we've been talking very nicely about standards, and the standards are, some of them are mandated, some of them I think there's hope that they will be mandated around the world. So regulation itself, however, that is the thing that's driving a lot of this. It's not just about the standards. So, for example, the CSRD also asks for reporting locations sign off. It asks for assurance. So it's bringing together a much bigger picture. And you recently wrote a piece for PwC where you stated that CSRD, or Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, is resetting the value creation agenda. So could you describe briefly what you mean by that?
Yeah, so CSRD is coming, and is coming very quickly, right? The first companies have to report on their 2024 performance in early 2025. And while the letter of the CSRD, it is a reporting directive at the end, right? But it does call, the intent really is to drive the change in business conduct that I just explained at the outset of our conversation, right? It does tie the strategy back to sustainability issues. It does require a business to identify the impacts, risks, and opportunities for its business. And it then asks companies to report their targets and then the performance against those targets next to a number of mandatory KPIs. Now, this will really then drive a change in performance, right? If you have to say out loud what you think and where you are at with your company, and that then gets consumed, it inevitably will result in a reaction to that, and that will drive the performance. So I think CEOs and chief executives in general are really, really well advised if they take this link to the strategy really at heart and integrate sustainability thinking into their strategy, right? So that's how CSRD, for example, I think is a very clear example of a reporting regulation, in fact it is, that has a certain purpose in mind. Now, that is special to the European Union because they are the regulator and they can mandate business to report on all these things with a bigger picture in mind around the Green Deal and enhancing sustainable business performance. That will be a different mechanism in other countries where, for example, ISSB standards might get adopted. This will be a much more indirect mechanism around the capital markets adopting that, and then through that dialogue with investors, the same behaviors hopefully will be driven out.
Yeah, we do see the very different approaches. Although I think one of the other waves that we've seen as an organization is that the CSRD, obviously it has some downstream or upstream effects, actually might be a better way of putting it. A lot of companies who are not headquartered in the European Union do have subsidiary presence and at least some substantial revenue presence in the European Union. And that regulation is not shy of asking them to also think about this reporting, whether it's at that subsidiary level or later on when eventually the extraterritorial requirements come in. So we've seen companies thinking about that, as a burden, but we've also seen some companies, to our earlier conversation, thinking of it as an opportunity and looking at the standards that have been produced to support the CSRD, the ESRS, as something that's a bit of a guide to tell them what their peers will be reporting and, keep that communication in line. So I think we will see some very sort of interesting effects outside the European Union as well.
No, absolutely. And we're working with some companies as well that are not headquartered in the EU that actually plan on or are considering at the moment, I don't think any formal decisions have been taken, but that are really considering applying CSRD reporting and the ESRS at the consolidated level. And that's companies who actually think hard about unearthing those opportunities that we talked about and using the compliance with the standards as a possibility to actually openly talk about their risks and how they are addressing them and the opportunities that come from that, right? So that is a very good example that you're just citing here.
So we mentioned CEOs briefly earlier. Obviously, strategy and business model, that makes a lot of sense. Are there other ways we see CEOs getting involved in this sustainability movement? And is that different to the way we see CFOs becoming involved? Or are we seeing a sort of different executive responsibilities across the organization?
Yeah, I mean, every organization is slightly different, but at the higher level of looking at it, the CEO is the leader of the company, right? So if we talk about strategy, if we talk about performance targets, and then being responsible for achievement of those performance targets, whether they are financial or whether they're a combination of financial and sustainability or only sustainability, it is the CEO who's on the spot and will be responsible to explain this to the outside, to the public. And if the CEO is not convinced about combining strategy with sustainability thinking, it will be hard to get the organization to follow, right? So in contrast, if you look at the CFO, I think the CFO, and I already beg forgiveness to some people who might not like the term, but I think the CFO often is the chief enabler. The CFO is responsible for a lot of processes. We all know that from financial reporting. It's a financing requirement sit with the CFO. Controlling of business processes and target evaluation and all of that sit in the CFO function. Engagement with customers and suppliers, contracting with business partners, all of that often sits in the CEO office. And with what I've been saying, I think it starts to become apparent that there is a very special responsibility of the CFO to make sustainability reporting, but also the performance measurement and driving the results possible, right? CFOs are the ones who know about group reporting, who know about controls and implementing technology to help with all of that. So the CFO is really, really instrumental in making any ambition on sustainability paired with transparent reporting happen in an orderly fashion.
Yeah, we're going to come back. We hear actually that list of expertise, ability to understand group reporting in that environment is something that we hear really commonly from organizations as they're considering how to bring finance organizations in or where the responsibilities should lie. I'm not sure I've heard as often actually some of that bigger picture. So I think maybe that is one of those areas where CFOs can really make a bigger difference than they're able to at the moment.
There's one more angle, right? If you think about it, we hear so much about greenwashing and can these data really be relied upon? So to me, the CFO is also the person who brings a lot of trust into the whole system. If the CFO gets properly engaged, users of the information understand that the information can be trusted. It comes from a controlled environment. So the data that need to be found and dealt with need that rigor around granularity, around sourcing, around is it actually verifiable what we're saying? And that often is an instinct that a CFO has. Chief operating officers or others, of course, they're interested in doing the right thing, but they sometimes don't have those CFO instincts that ask the right question at the right time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm going to pick up, and it might sound like a bit of a non sequitur, but it does tie very strongly actually back to that verifiability and that rigor in processes. So Workiva conducted a survey of ESG practitioners actually, and the overwhelming majority polled agreed that having adequate technology, so that was 95%, is critical to managing the reporting process. And 94% said technology is also important for mapping disclosures to regulations, frameworks, and standards. And I'd also argue data should be included in that picture as well. What role does technology play in this reporting-led transformation? Is it just about that rigor on the reporting, or does it help elsewhere as well?
Yeah, to me, it's the two E's, right? Efficiency and enabling that technology brings into the whole sustainability area, right? We all know about manual processes and how error prone those can be despite the best intention of the individuals performing them. And we all know the efficiencies that came about in financial reporting when we start to implement technology at whatever process, at the ERP process, at the data sourcing process. Automatic controls are so much more efficient and easier once they are done right than manual controls. So transporting that whole thinking of financial reporting into sustainability reporting makes total sense to me. And technology will be key to making a cumbersome exercise. And again, let's not forget that we are not so familiar with all the thinking and the sources of the data because we haven't done that for decades and decades and sometimes centuries as we are with financial reporting. So technology needs to help us to come to grips with all these data that we need to manage and then put into a reporting. And then on top of that, across the world, we see increasing regulatory action, and not only regulatory action or reporting, but regulatory action around sustainability issues and topics. So again, the case for technology, I think, is very, very obvious.
We're heading towards the closeout for this episode. We like to try and end with a piece of advice or something that companies can take away with them to get going on the topic of the day. So I'm going to ask this as a single. I know it's a nearly impossible question to answer that way, but what would you say is the single most important step business leaders can take if they're interested in getting going in reporting-led transformation?
Yeah, look, the inevitable, get started somewhere. And whether you get started on finding the data in your company and evaluating them to inform your strategy and then reporting after that, or whether you go the other way around on having a debate around your strategy and how that really embeds sustainability thinking and sustainable action with a view to long-term value creation. Start somewhere and get going with it, because the reporting deadlines start sneaking up on us. It's not going away, I think.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. It's been really fantastic to have you on ESG Talk today. I hope the audience have taken a lot away from that.
Thank you so much, Andie and Workiva, for having me on this ESG Talk.
Whether it was your first time listening to this episode or you're enjoying it a second time, thank you for joining us on ESG Talk, brought to you by Workiva, the world's only unified platform for financial reporting, ESG, audit and risk. If you liked this episode, please check out our recent episode with PwC US and Playa Hotels and Resorts, which discusses how companies can find the right partner and technology to create a reporting-led transformation. And as always, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to see episodes from Season 3 on Apple, Spotify or YouTube. We'll talk again soon.